Hi, I'm Professor Martin, and today we are going to talk about money. Yes, I feel like money is not discussed enough in the college classroom, so we're going to talk about money. More specifically, we're going to talk about the cost of being a college student. Now, I will preface this with it is not just the cost of tuition. If you are a college student, or if you've ever been a college student, you know there's a lot more involved in being a college student than just paying for your tuition. No one gets to show up to class naked, so you have to have clothes. You don't want to go to class hungry. It's very hard to study and to focus. When your stomach is growling, you have to eat, right? And there's only so many years you can eat and steal from your parents' fridge when they're not looking, right? You're gonna have to eat. Ideally, some nice, healthy, nutritious meals. You're gonna need textbooks. You're gonna need school supplies, a backpack, pen and paper, highlighters, things like that. You never wanna show up to class empty-handed, right? And if there is a textbook and it's required, you must have the textbook. You're going to have personal expenses. You might need dental appointments during the semester. You might need to see your family practitioner. You might have a gym that you might have to pay for, right? We want to stay physically strong. You might need a personal trainer to keep you motivated or to help you reach your goals in that area. There's all kinds of personal expenses that come up. We need a place to live. Again, you can only live in your parents' basement for so long before maybe they're like, okay, it's time. Like, you gotta go now, right? In learning to be self-sufficient adults, these are expenses that we might be paying by ourselves, okay? If you have family that is helping you, please hug them and thank them, because it is not just hard to academically be a student, but it's hard to be a student and try to figure out how you're going to pay your rent when you're a full-time student, and how you're going to graduate to eating something other than ramen and InState macaroni. It's hard to figure out how to see your friends and how to at least have a little bit of a social life. And when on earth are you ever going to be able to turn your TV on again because you're so busy studying and doing your homework? Ideally, right? No one should be binge watching Netflix if you are a student. Like, those days are over. But all of these are costs, right? They're all costs, and you're going to have to likely pay them. Okay, so if you are at the stage where you're trying to do some research and trying to figure out what it costs to get into college and you're not yet in college, this is a great place to start. If you're already a college student, but maybe you're not paying your tuition because you have relatives that are paying your tuition, or maybe you are very lucky and you have a scholarship or some kind of grants and your tuition is at least mostly being covered, you might not have taken the time to really investigate what the value is that you're receiving. The college that I work for has a tuition-free philosophy, and most students, many students, get to attend tuition-free. Someone is paying that tuition, it is just not the student. So for all of my very lucky students out there, please know how lucky you are, and it's time that we actually look at the numbers so that you can see the value that you're receiving. And as we learn and grow and progress in our career, in our personal lives, and we're ready to move on to the next higher degree, or we want to become a transfer student, we need to know ahead of time, way ahead of time, what that cost is going to be. And we'll get into this more when we talk about career research. But if you want to be a doctor, if you want to be a lawyer, like I always said, if you have big hopes and dreams, and they are expensive hopes and dreams, you need to know that early. It took me almost 10 years to figure out how to pay for law school. It took a really long time. You have to know the number. You have to know the numbers. It is just not enough to cross your fingers and hope that when you get to the point that you could start applying to law school or medical school or whatever it is, whatever you want to be, whatever it is, your beautiful mind is dreaming up, you want to know that way ahead of time. If your dream is to become a rocket scientist, it's actually one of my dreams, you're going to need to know before you ever enroll in your first college class, how do I get from where I am right now to where I'm going to be? And a lot of that is going to be the cost. How much is it going to cost me? Not just to get through an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, your doctoral degree as well. Like how much is it going to cost? So today we're going to talk about the cost of being a student. Again, it's more than just tuition, though tuition is probably going to be the biggest chunk. Okay, so what does it cost? What does it cost exactly? So I'm going to ask you to follow along with me. We're going to look at an example together, and then I would like you to do a little research on your own so that you can try to figure out what is the value of the education that you're receiving under your scholarship or grants, or if a family member is paying and you have no idea what they're paying, right? You want to know how big of a Christmas gift to give them this year and like how much you need to be thankful to them by how much money you aren't paying on your own. And again, we want to know these numbers, okay? We want to know what we're investing into ourselves and what we can be expecting to get back from a future employer or from life in general as we progress, because now if you have a $50,000 education, you are $50,000 at a minimum more valuable, okay? And we're talking about assets that can equate to monetary value. So of course, we're all special and wonderful in our own ways, right? But we're talking about marketable skills that will bring us income. Okay, there is something important to note when you're considering the cost of tuition, which is where we're going to start. If you go to a public school, there will likely be an in-state and an out-of-state rate. If you are state resident, and a lot of states legally determine residency by if you've been a year in that state and you plan to remain in that state. A lot of times, if you're only going to be in the state for a couple years and you're just going to get your educational leave, you will not be considered a resident of the state for tuition purposes. So let's look at an example between an in-state tuition and an out-of-state tuition. It is often at least double, and this is something to consider. If you are open to going anywhere in the United States, all 50 states, nothing is off limit to get the degree you want or to go to the schools you want. If you just want to be at a college that's by the ocean, that is okay. But if you're moving states, you might have to pay the out-of-state tuition rate. So plan for the tuition to at least double. If that's the case, and if you might have to move states, it might be more advantageous for you to consider a private college or a private educational institution, because if they're private, they are not going to consider in-state and out-of-state. And if you are legally savvy, if you're one of my law students and it triggers discrimination, right? Is it okay to discriminate against someone and charge them 2.5 times the tuition rate because they don't live in the state? Yes. Yes, the Supreme Court says yes. So it's actually not considered discrimination to out-of-state students. It's an actual benefit. It's considered that the in-state resident is getting a discount instead of the out-of-state resident being charged more. So it's really just a presentation method. But if you live in the state, because it's a state school, the state is allowed to give benefits to its own residents, right? If I am a resident of Maryland, which I have been for 2.5 years or so now from California, if I were to be a student, which I am, I get the in-state rate. How that benefits the state is that if I'm a resident, if I'm here, I'm paying into the taxes, I'm using the roadways, I'm paying the road tolls, I'm investing into the community. I have to buy groceries, right? I have to buy clothes. I buy a lot of stuff here. I pay taxes here, right? I'm investing into the community. The state is investing in me and my education. Also, to attract bright students that are going to come and invest into the community long term, that are going to stay and get jobs here and maybe create jobs here, right? These are all good reasons for the state to offer a discount to their residents. Residents are going to graduate and better the workforce. Okay, so just know that if you are not a state resident of the state you're considering, just know my suggestion is to go a year early, to get accepted into the school, to move there, and to defer your attendance, defer your becoming a student at their school for a year. And that's a very common thing. Schools will allow generally one deferment where you can get accepted for, say, the 2024 school year. Once you get accepted, defer it until the 2025 school year. And schools know, like, students do this for tuition purposes, right? If you can save 2.5 times the tuition, do it. So schools know it's a very common practice. And if you're in a hurry and you just want your degree and you are totally okay paying the extra tuition, that's okay. But if the cost of tuition is a concern for you, you can always move to the state a year early. After the year, you can get your state residency if you plan to reside, and then you can go to that college and you can get the in-state tuition rate. So there is a way around it, but just know, doing your research, if you're not a state resident at the moment, plan, just to be safe, plan to have to pay the out-of-state tuition rate. Okay, and a lot of scholarships and grants won't cover that difference between in-state and out-of-state because it's a penalty that isn't directly going to the education. If some students can get tuition for $10,000, and if the company that's paying your scholarship or your grant can do it in $10,000, they're not going to want to pay $25,000. They only want to pay $10,000, and they might not even want to pay that. So they want to be looking out for their money as well and making sure that it's a good investment. So if you're hoping for a scholarship or grant, just know you might have to cover the difference between the in-state rate and the out-of-state rate, which is essentially you're paying your own tuition at that point. Like, because the tuition is being paid 2.5 times if you're at least twice, right? So even if your scholarship covers the in-state rate and you have to pay the out-of-state rate, that difference, if it's twice as much, you're both paying the in-state tuition essentially. So we don't want to do that. Just something to keep in mind while you're doing your research. Okay, so our greatest expense is likely going to be tuition and fees. If you are at a community college or a state undergraduate program, you're likely going to find tuition based on credit hour. For a community college, it's very common to have a per credit hour fee of between $50 and $250. And then when you start getting to your bigger universities or your higher levels of education, it might be charged by semester. And they might have a part-time rate and a full-time rate. So just depending on what your status is as a student. Are you a part-time student, which is typically 6 credit hours per semester or less? Or are you full-time, which is typically 12 credit hours or more, but this can vary from school to school. So you want to know, what is the cost of your tuition? What is the in-state rate? What is the out-of-state rate? Next, you want to look at books and supplies. The college will give you an estimate, but that is just an estimate. Some classes will have really expensive textbooks. Other classes may not even require a textbook, or the textbook might be optional, or the textbook is one that you could rent for $10 a semester, or one that is in your local library and you can just check it out and you're not paying for it. So the books and supplies is always an estimate, and likely it will go based on program. So one undergraduate degree might have a different textbook estimate than another, but you don't have to guess. That is something the school will tell you. Next is transportation. For this, the school again will give you all these numbers, but what is going to be the determining factor is, are you going to use public transportation or do you have to maintain your own vehicle? If you have a vehicle of your own, you're going to save on the every single trip expense, but you are going to have to do things like do oil changes and do regular maintenance and do unscheduled maintenance for flat tires and broken gaskets. And I don't know anything about cars, so no, I'm going to stop before I start making things up. But whatever could happen to a car, you're going to have to cover those expenses, right? And it is never an excuse to not go to class because you had transportation issues. Okay, so I know you need transportation to get to class, but it's just one of those things that is just not an excuse to not make it to class because of that. Okay, your personal expenses. This is very personal, but again, the school will give you an estimate. If you're someone that has a lot of personal expenses that maybe not everyone has, if you consistently get your nails done or your hair done, or if you're a guy and you like to have your car polished a lot, or if you have a ton of animals and they require a lot of upkeep, just know that this number can vary. I typically tend to not spend anywhere near the estimate the schools provide, the schools that I've gone to for personal expenses. So again, all of these numbers are just in general, and it's always a good idea to keep track of your personal expenses each month to know about what you're spending. So while you can use the college's number as an example, the better way to go is to just keep track of your own finances. Next, if you are paying your tuition, you are probably getting some sort of loan to do so, and you're going to have loan fees. Depending on the type of loan, you might not have to pay anything until after you graduate, or you might have a loan where you have to pay on the interest until you graduate, or you might have to pay a certain percentage of the principal until you graduate, or you might have just a personal loan that isn't specifically an education loan, and then you might have to just pay monthly on both the principal and the interest. But you will want to consider, if you are financing your education, it does get more expensive. You will have to pay loan fees and interest, and over the course of a 4-year degree or an 8-year degree or whatever the duration of your degree, all of those fees add up. Next is housing and food. Depending on what you like to eat, if you are a steak and potato kind of person and you like your lobster and seafood, you might be higher than the average. And then if you have a very basic diet, like I love fruits and vegetables, my grocery bill is always pretty cheap. It's just because those are just the foods that I like, and I like to cook and I like to eat in because I like to know what's in my food. So it is very hard for me to meet the minimum delivery for groceries. But again, the food is something that can be particular, and then the housing is always by area. Surprisingly, my apartment cost more here in Baltimore than it did in San Diego. And in San Diego, I was just blocks away from the ocean. And I'm not blocks away from really anything here. But housing can be particular to that area. So this would be a good example of a category that you really want to take the word of the institution. They're there, they're part of the community, they know what mortgage rates are and what the rent is going for in the area. So that's probably the most accurate number that they're going to give you for the estimate. And again, this can vary if you are planning to share an apartment or share other housing, or if you're going to live rent-free with parents or with a relative, but you will still have to consider housing. And finally, after we've added all of that up, we get to our cost of attendance. Our cost of attendance, because again, we don't care about just tuition, especially if we don't have a job while we're a student. We want to know from start to finish, for the duration of the degree, how long is it going to take? Because it is not fun to find out that you don't have enough to cover your whole 4-year degree or your whole 3-year degree or all of law school or all of medical school because you don't factor in that cost of attendance times 3 or times 4 or times 5 or whatever your number is. So we want to consider our cost of attendance is the cost per semester, generally per semester, but look at the college, what they provide you, and it should say the duration. So is it a semester? Is it a year? It's often by semester. The example we're looking at from the University of Maryland, it is for the undergraduate degree. If you're examining the cost of any other degree, just make sure you're on the right degree, because the higher the degree, the higher the cost, and you don't want to factor in the cost of an undergraduate degree if you're going to work on your master's degree, right? The difference will be huge. Okay, so using the example of the University of Maryland, the undergraduate degree seeking student, we're looking at a full-time enrollment, which is 12 credit hours. For a Maryland resident, your tuition alone is just under $10,000. If you are out of state, if you're an out-of-state student, it is going to cost you almost $24,000. Okay, but again, that is not the total cost of attendance. That is just the tuition and fees. And there's always fees. There's fees onto every class. So if you're just trying to mathematically compute just the cost of the credit hour tuition, there's always fees. There's going to be lab fees and internet fees. And if you have an online course, there's going to be a web fee and there's technology fees. There is a lot of fees. So they really take advantage of that, of charging fees. If you were going to get a 4-year degree with the University of Baltimore and you lived in Maryland, the total cost of attendance is going to be $35,102. I told you it will blow your mind. I've been saying over and over again, right? Tuition is not cheap. Tuition is not cheap. So now, right, we're going to have some hard numbers so that we can all really appreciate and understand. When you hear that tuition is not cheap, now you can know exactly what is meant by tuition is not cheap. Okay, so it is now your turn to do a little research on your own. Go to the college that you are considering, or college that you're exploring, or a future college that you want to consider the cost of attendance for your next degree or your level up degree, and do a search for the cost of attendance. If you just look at the tuition page, they're probably just going to show you the cost of tuition and the breakdown. If you go to financial aid, they might only give you options to apply for financial aid. What you want to do is just, you can even do a Google search for cost of attendance and then the name of the school you're considering. And it should bring up a PDF or a web page, or it should direct you to somewhere where you can find the full breakdown. And it should contain an estimate for all the categories we've discussed today. And now you can do your own research. And again, if you are a scholarship or a grant recipient, you can now see what the cost is that you don't have to pay yourself, and possibly write your state a thank you note, or the family member that is paying for your tuition, or the federal government if they're giving you federal grant money, and just say thank you for the value that you're receiving on their behalf. Okay, that is everything for the cost of attendance. I hope you have a really great day in class.